This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network. This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'm back again for another episode of my month of 1,000 podcast celebration. Today, I'm thrilled to have back with me Jonathan Marks. Jonathan is a partner at Baker & Tilly, and he is going to visit with us about what he has seen in the way of developments over the past 5 years in investigations, and specifically forensic accounting investigations. So, Jonathan, thanks again for taking the time to visit with me.
Thanks, Tom. I really appreciate you having me. And, the topic is certainly very interesting in that, forensic accounting, most people don't know this, but forensic accounting is relatively new. It goes back, I believe, to the 1800s, and I think it was more formalized in the 1940s and the 1950s. But, the job of being a forensic accountant is relatively new. And so, looking back 5 years, sort of, where we were 5 years ago, and then kind of pulling that forward and then looking ahead is certainly something interesting to talk about. 5 years ago, from a forensic accounting perspective, it was basically, from a skills perspective, we were looking for people that had auditing skills, certainly, and investigative skills, to examine certain information and so on and so forth in preparation for a court of law. That's sort of been the moniker of a forensic accountant. And as you well know, with the uptick in global bribery and with the uptick and more sensitivity related around compliance, that role has really expanded. And so, where once was, somebody was looking for someone to examine records and fact find and pull things together, which was certainly important. Today, even more so, if we pull that all the way forward, it's not only the auditing skills, it's not only the financial skills, it's the understanding of human behavior, it's the understanding of technology and electronically stored information. It's the understanding of not only completing the investigation but finding the root cause as to why that particular situation took place. It's really understanding more from a granular perspective internal controls. So when we look back 5 years ago and then we look and we bring it forward to today, there really have been some remarkable advancements, from a technology perspective in the form of, really utilizing, data analytics and the like. But more importantly, from a skill set perspective, I see today, and when I'm looking at folks today and we're talking about forensic accountants, I don't just see someone who is there to rip through books and records, put something together, and then, be prepared to go potentially testify in a court of law. I see a forensic accountant today as as a professional that's a lot more valuable in that the value add that they can bring from not only from a controls perspective, but from a compliance perspective, from an operational perspective, and so on and so forth, is really what the expectation is. So, thanks to, regulatory changes, thanks to, the expansion of business to a more global platform has really, really upped the game of the forensic accountant.
So let me kind of flip the question a little bit, Jonathan, because you answered it in terms of the forensic accounting part of investigation. But now let me ask you, from the perspective of forensic accountant, what have you seen evolve in terms of an anti-corruption investigation where a lawyer may hire you? You specifically talked about understanding human nature, the technology, and the root cause. Are these things that lawyers who retained you some 5 or plus years ago would have asked you to to do, or did they even understand what they were? And how have you been able to educate, people like me, lawyer types, on these issues from your perspective?
Tom, they didn't even ask the question 5 years ago, but today it's sort of an expectation, and that's a great point. Root cause wasn't even in the conversation. It wasn't even in the work plan. When it comes to human nature and really understanding, how these potential bribery schemes could be concealed, nobody asked whether, they were less concerned about your ability to really understand and digest those schemes from a humanistic perspective or from a psychological perspective, but more so to, just rip through the books and records and follow the money. And, that's really where it has changed. And that's really what the expectation is today.
So one of the things that's intrigued me, Jonathan, is how what may have started out as either a response to a legal requirement, i.e. the FCPA, or a company investigating, hiring someone like you to investigate a potential fraud and loss of money, bleeding out of money within the organization, has really now moved to what you characterized as the root cause. And by requiring a root cause analysis, it occurs to me that a company can not only remediate the situation, but actually create a stronger business process. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, recidivistic behavior is something that nobody ever wants to talk about. And for those that don't understand what recidivism is, it's an ugly word that basically means, it happened again. It's a repeat. And, I think a lot of times what would happen is, we would complete an investigation and we would pack our bags and go home. And sometimes the recommendations that we would make were more on the symptoms rather than the root cause. So, root cause has really, really changed the nature of the game. But I think it's also an expectation of the regulators today is that, when somebody completes an investigation and they're going through and remediating gaps and deficiencies and looking at internal controls, they expect someone, like us, like me, like, the legal team and us, to really identify what those root cause issues are and really make sure that, whether it's, further disciplinary action, whether it's further training, whether it's the revamp of, different control structures, whether it's, designing controls in a way where, different objectives have to be met, certain approvals, using automation and technology as a weapon in this as well. Those are all things that are coming into play today.
So one of the things that has struck me, Jonathan, is that the ACFE and others have consistently talked about red flags around fraud. Indicia for fraud, part of that's the fraud triangle, part of it's the fraud pentagon. But what red flags or other evidence might pop up to indicate that fraud might be occurring? And those have some of those factors are on individuals. And in the anti-compliance world, we really haven't focused on those behavioral factors that might lead to a further investigation. Do you see that evolving as well, or you, people like yourself, really having to have some very basic conversations with the people that hire you from the legal perspective about the red flags around fraud and how they might apply to anti-corruption compliance?
No, I think that's a great question. And, when everybody talks about the fraud triangle and the fraud pentagon these days, which is great. But if you look at the fraud triangle, for example, pressure, opportunity, and rationalization, and you expand it to the fraud pentagon, which includes competence and arrogance, those behavioral elements are kind of interesting. When you blow that out into more of the meta model of fraud and you look at sort of the crime, the act, concealment, and the conversion piece, I think that's where everyone was really focused on. They were focused on, what the act was, how it was concealed, and how it was converted. So when we're actually coming back and we're pulling everything together today, and by the way, I caution everyone, I'm not a licensed psychologist and I'm not certified, in psychology or sociology or anything, but, with 30 plus years of experience, we know what behaviors, tend to be there. So focusing on the human element and really understanding that and looking at the potential bad actor or bad actors, I think we go back and really take a good holistic view and say, look at the pressure, look at the pressures placed on that individual, look at competence, look at arrogance, look at rationalization, really look at those things, understand how that behavior manifested itself. And again, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a doctor or PhD in sociology, but I do understand human behavior when it comes to, potentially committing a fraudulent act. And so I think that expectation today is really there. And it should be interesting because, there were some recent court cases where some, forensic accountants kind of tried to get into the mind behind, the individual. And, the courts have really hammered those folks for trying to do that. However, I do think from a practical perspective and really from, an expectation perspective, really understanding those individuals that are potentially playing in this. And then again, looking and drilling down and saying, is this a bad apple? Did this bad apple create a bad bunch? Is there a bad crop of people? For example, you can have a manager, that's in one country that, is potentially doing something that's not legal. And for some reason, he's punished, and that's fine. But then he gets promoted or he moves on to, another part of the globe and another part of the operation. And what we have seen is that those behaviors are just latent. They come out at some point, especially when there's an opportunity to certainly do that. And, so they take and pollinate, those individuals that, are susceptible to being sucked into this and then continue that bad behavior throughout the organization. And that's why, again, when it comes to, what's the role of the forensic accountant or the investigator today, it's really, really important to look at those behaviors and really understand them. It's really important to understand, how they manifested themselves, where this individual came, who they interacted with, are there other red flags around there? We all love to talk about red flags, and a lot of those things are certainly hidden in plain sight. But I think one of the things that this really brings out, and we haven't really gone there yet, is really the disciplinary aspect of all this. And I've been asked more and more over my career, what do you recommend from a disciplinary perspective? That really never happened before. That was really left up to the company to make a determination, and certainly the lawyers and the like. But I've been roped into conversations over the past years on what's our opinion with regards to this. Do we believe that we've seen enough of this that potentially this person can't be trained or retrained, or that they might in effect pollinate others, and suck them into these bad behaviors. So that's a big change from 4, 5, 6 years ago to today. And I see that continuing going forward.
So one of the things I've heard you talk about, Jonathan, is interview skills, interview techniques, sitting across from either the fraudster, the recalcitrant employer, or someone else you're interviewing, and really focusing on them to try and make a determination if they are telling you the truth. That is not a conversation I typically hear from forensic auditors. They're generally much more focused on following the money, the books and records, perhaps the internal controls. Is that also an evolution you have seen?
Yeah, and it's one that, I think we all try as professionals to, throw ourselves out there as human lie detectors. And, some are certainly better than others. But I think, through experience and certainly, some skills and some training, I think we've all become very sensitized to that. And there's sort of an expectation of that. You got to remember, fraud is not about obstruction. It's about deflection, distraction. It's a game. White collar criminals or fraudsters profile us just like we're trying to profile them. So a very, very skilled fraudster is in an interview is sometimes very, very difficult to trick up. Now, there are tools and techniques and certainly, various trainings that go on that certainly help us in that regard. But, interviewing is definitely something that, you do get better with it over time. I've interviewed a ton of people, it's certainly in my career. I would never, ever classify myself, even though I think I'm very good at it, as someone who is, a human lie detector. But, I think, we always say, the evidence is grounded in the facts. And, if you really do understand the facts and you can go into an interview and have those facts, it's a lot easier. There are a lot of folks that have a different approach that like to get in an interview early. And sometimes, let's just face it, the facts sort of develop over time. They're not always readily available. And so, taking a first crack at someone and basically coming back at them later, is certainly an option. And, that's a very, very interesting area. And, it's going to be very interesting to see where it actually heads in the future. But, I always temper my conversations with, folks that I'm dealing with that, look, we're not human lie detectors. We're not perfect creatures. We're not necessarily experts in human behavior, but we do try to, take all those things into consideration from what we learned over the years and apply those in a way where, certainly could benefit us from, truth-seeking, type of statements from, from the alleged fraudster. But definitely an interesting topic.
So, Jonathan, I've talked about, or we've visited rather, about the change in expectations for the investigation of a forensic auditor. We've talked about the changes that the legal function has seen in working with someone like yourself. How about at the board of directors level? Because you've been hired by several boards. Have their expectations either changed, or have boards matured in their understanding of their role in corporate governance?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great and insightful question, and something certainly I'm very passionate about. Boards are becoming more attuned to, what they're looking for. They just don't want someone to come in there and rip through things. They want someone to come in there. They want a forensic accountant and investigator to come in there that do understand corporate governance, that do understand compliance, that do understand the legal function, that understand audit, that understands risk management. So yes, their expectations have changed. And if they haven't, they should. One-trick ponies are just not the norm anymore. Boards are looking to get to the right answer as well, and they don't like recidivistic behavior, and they don't want recidivistic behavior. So they want to know, where things broke down. You and I have talked about this ad nauseum. When we look at today, we look at the legal function, the compliance function, and internal audit. Those three functions within a company or in an organization that are not operating, harmonious in a harmonious manner, could be disastrous. And we call it the Bermuda Triangle. I think boards are becoming more insightful with regard to that. They're starting to understand the components of corporate governance and how those pieces all come together. From a communication perspective, from the way committees are set up, from the way they're employing risk management and global risk management from within the organization. They are actually better educated today, thanks to, obviously, thanks to the bad behavior of others, which have sort of upped their game as well. But, there are, a bunch of organizations out there have really tried, to put this stuff, right out in front of them and really get them to pivot, in a way where they, are not just asking for answers regarding to an investigation. They really want to understand the 360 here, and they really want to, make sure that somebody coming in does have experience, related to not only the regulatory issues and dealing with the regulators, but, helping them from a governance perspective.
And really, the last group I'd like to ask about, Jonathan, is the one you just mentioned, the regulators. You've sat across the table from a wide variety of regulators, and have their expectations changed for someone like yourself, an investigator around forensic accounting?
Again, yes. I mean, if you look at, if you look at subpoenas or things that come from the SEC, they're asking for board minutes, and they've asked for these things for years. But I think their understanding today and really what they're driving at is they want to understand that that the organization is not only looking at potentially ring fencing in the bad behavior, but why that behavior occurred. Root cause is now front and center, and it should be, and for good reason. And so my conversations with folks on the regulatory side have not only been from hey, look, this is what we found. These are the accounting issues, but also more from an internal control, from a tone perspective, and certainly from a governance perspective. And so again, this one-dimensional type of or multi-dimensional type of exercise that once existed, which was called an investigation, I think has really manifested itself into sort of this multi-dimensional expectation and exercise that is really become the norm, and I see it going forward in the future.
Well, Jonathan, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but this has been a fascinating exploration of a topic that really expanded out in a variety of ways. So thank you again for taking the time to visit with me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Tom. I always like talking about this stuff.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. I hope you'll join me next week when I am back with another guest. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.